Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerStrategy.com, back with part 2 of this $215 multi-table tournament review. Our hero so far has won 2 matches in a row, both in pretty similar fashion, where he called down big 3-barrel bluffs with like middle pair first stack. And I mentioned in the last video I'm not too fond of that. Maybe we'll see how he wins these other games. It'd be pretty cool if we won every game the same way. It'd be very interesting. So anyways, on to match 3. You will find that in these heads-up games, or these heads-up multi-table tournaments, they get rather tough as you get deeper and deeper. It's obviously anyone can win any number of heads-up matches in a row, but the cream really does tend to rise to the top in these things. So expect them to get a little bit tougher as you get further and further along. Here with King 10 you can call or 3-bet, either one's fine. I usually like to 3-bet early in the tournament just to sort of set up that I can 3-bet, and that will kind of make my opponent a little bit less eager to raise my blinds. Anyways, you can call though, that's fine too. I would go for a check raise here. You check raise small. This is something that I mentioned you do in the last videos, where when you flop the nuts very early in the game, tend to check raise small to try to rope your opponent in. Your opponent does call, which is fantastic. I would bet like 180 on the turn, and your opponent folds. I don't know if there's a big difference between 180 and 200, but I would tend to just keep it a little bit on the smaller side just to try to rope him in a little bit more. I would definitely fire some barrels here. This is a pretty good spot just to keep firing. On the river, you may actually have the best hand here. When you bet the flop, your opponent could call with any of the straight draws. There are quite a few straight draws out there. If he has a flush draw, he's probably gotten there by now, unless he has like 10-9 exactly. That being said, you could probably get your opponent off an 8 if you bet again. So I think I would probably go ahead and bet again, something like 260. And you do bet 240, so that's pretty cool. We would have played the hand exactly the same way. When the board runs off like two overcards that you could easily have to the top pair on the flop, like it did right here, you can almost always represent that pretty strongly. So I like the bet. If you had a jack in this spot, I would value bet it. If you had like pocket tens, I'd probably value bet that as well. King 8 suited is another hand I would generally tend to 3-bet. You seem to like calling with these hands, like King 8 suited, Queen 8 suited. I kind of discussed that in the last video, where you tend to be dominated a lot of the time, and if you 3-bet, you get them off a lot of those hands that dominate you. So anyways, you go for the check raise here on the flop. I would probably make it 100 here again, although I think 120 is fine. Seeing that they called last time, then just folded to a turn bet, it's never like bad if they call you on the flop. So he does call. I would definitely just go ahead and continue firing. Something that is worth noting is that notice you have been making it round numbers for a lot of this video, or a lot of this the first series and then this series. I don't know if you've made it any of these random numbers. Now all of a sudden with a flush draw, when you check raise it, which I think is one of the first time this has happened, you make it 123, and then you bet some weird number 222 on the turn. This is probably tell to some extent, so be very careful that you don't turn your hand face up in spots like that. Obviously this guy doesn't know anything about your game, but be careful about it. Here you bet the flop in the turn. The flop bet's certainly fine. The turn bet I think is okay. There are quite a few draws you can charge here, so I would bet the turn. I'd probably bet a little bit larger though, probably 120. Then I'd check the river. Yeah, I would check this river for sure. And the reason I check this river is because the straight's got there. He probably isn't going to call another bet with worse than a 5. So, yeah, I like a check on the river. I think you played that one pretty good. You also seem to like raising Jack 4. Hands like that, I tend to fold them. If there are some heads-up pros in the forums, though, you can certainly convince me that raising Jack 4 every time is plus EV, but I think it's pretty tough to play. That ace 3 offsuit, you could have 3-bet it, or called. Either one's fine. I would take my opponent to value town here. 9 on the river is not good. If the river was an ace 7, 6, 5, 4, or 3, or 2, I would probably value bet the river again. When the river comes 9, I would just go ahead and check it back. I think it's too likely your opponent has something in here that you can't really beat. He could easily have 8, 9. He could have maybe 9, 10. He's just getting calling stationy with. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I don't know. This is a close spot, but I do think your opponent could have the gut shots, and if he could have the gut shots, he could have gotten there. So I just would not have fired again. And I think he could get off an 8. That's the other problem, is that there may just not be any hands that he calls with. Let's start this hand over. Your opponent raises and you call. When he checks back the flop, you should generally bet the turn. I think this is a play that will show a lot of profit in the long run. Anytime your opponent shows weakness on the flop, just fire away. And I mean, I think you've proven that yourself. A lot of the hands where you've checked back on the flop, you've been willing to fold. So I think a lot of opponents do the exact same thing. So anytime they check it back, just go ahead and bet them off of whatever they have. You could 3-bet this ace 6. I would check call the turn. On the river, I'd go ahead and throw it a value bet. So that's pretty good. There, your opponent limped for the first time. Always worth noting when they limp the first time. Definitely fold ace-x to a 3-bet. I think that's something that a lot of weaker players fail to do, is they don't fold the ace-x's to the 3-bets. But I do think it's definitely a good play. You've done a really good job of grinding down your opponent every game so far. I don't really know if it's just purely variance, but you grounded him down beautifully. Okay, so you get check raised with a flush draw. You have a backdoor gut shot and an overcard, which could be worth something. Right here you have to call 100 to win 345, so you're getting 3.5 to 1 right here, which is pretty good immediate odds. You'll certainly get more than that back in implied odds, so calling is never really that bad here. But I think you may be better off just jamming it in. The thing is that your queen high could be good, and you never really want to get bluffed off a hand that could easily be the best hand. Whenever people check raise these boards, it's usually with either a 5, or I guess they could have an 8, or they could have a draw, and you beat a lot of the draws. The only real disaster is when he has the king or the ace of heart draw. I don't know. Calling's fine, jamming's fine. I would have jammed, and you do jam, so that's good. He raises and you ship in with the ace-king, that's fine. And you win. Took that guy out fast. So I think that endgame pretty much played itself. I like the way you played this king 10 here. I'm not too sure if you planned on calling a river bet. If I was PS Mosaic here with the 6s, I would have bet the flop, check the turn, then I would have definitely bet the river. Unless you have a diamond, you're going to have a tough time calling. And even though you do have 2 pair here, I think it still would be a close call. I probably would have found a call there, though, because you do beat a lot of the... Well, if it doesn't have a diamond, you win for the most part. And usually you're going to be getting like 2 to 1 that he has a diamond, which is perfectly fine odds. However, seeing that he didn't bluff with the 6s, check calling is probably really bad against this opponent because he's not bluffing. If he has no bluffs in his range, then check calling with a bluff catcher is really bad. So You have to be careful in spots like that, especially in heads up. You just kind of assume everyone knows how to bluff, and that was a pretty good spot for him to bluff, and he didn't do it. So I would not be looking to make too many like bluff catching calls against this guy. I'd probably call the 3-bet here with the king queen. Pretty good spot to float. Oh, and you bink it. So now that you have got the nuts, I think you have to bet something, but I would bet generally small here. I'd probably bet like 220. If you bet 265, I think that's okay. I would just go a little bit on the smaller side. One good thing about 265 is that you set it up for a 3/4 spot river shove, but notice that 220 is basically the same thing. It just keeps it cheaper for him now to call the river shove. Something you always need to think about when you have the nuts is how to get his whole stack in. I'm sure you know this because you look like you did it fine. But say you both had 1,500 chips behind, which is obviously impossible, but say you both had 1,500 chips behind, I'd probably bet something like 350 on this board, because then you want the pot to be about 1,200, so you can then shove 1,200 on the river. You wouldn't really want to bet 250 in that spot, because then you'd have more than a pot size shove, which probably won't get called too often. So always think about the pot size compared to the money left in everyone's stack, and set up good shove sizes to where your opponent kind of feels committed, while still roping them in the hand if at all possible. I'd probably throw out a bet here with a gut shot and backdoor flush draw. I would fold the queen nine basically every time. He's getting a little bit short to where you're not getting too good of implied odds. Obviously, we can't fold a 9. I would definitely call. The ace is really bad. The problem with the ace is when he bets... Well, actually, whether or not he bets or checks, you're probably behind. If he bets, though, it's kind of interesting. You may actually be ahead more often than not because he's probably bluffing something. But whenever he checks, I think a lot of guys will check here with an ace to try to get you to spaz out at it. I don't know. It's a close spot. Anyways... He checks again on the river. Not too sure what that means. You may have the best hand here. I don't really think you should value bet it, though. I think your opponent could easily have an overpair. Well, like 10s, jacks, queens, kings. Obviously not 10s anymore. And I don't think you're going to be able to get him off of those hands too often. You did have jack 10. I'm a little bit surprised he didn't barrel the turn. That's a pretty good barrel board. And if he does barrel the turn, you have a really crappy spot with the 9 there. I don't think you would have folded it, but it's probably not. It's probably close between a call and a fold. All right. Anyways, he raises. You call with ace 6 suited. I think 3-betting here would be fine. Here's this exact same line you take with bottom pair. I don't think I would value bet this river. There are just too many made hands that he could have that beat you, and I don't really see what he's going to call you with that you're ahead of. Unless you just think he's going to hero call you with ace high. I would have played this hand exactly the same way. So that's good. I think check calling down with something that beats a lot of his betting range is fine, and also a hand that's not really susceptible to draws, like the king jack on a queen jack X. But say you had the X, like say it was queen jack 3 and you had ace 3, I'm not too sure I would like calling down near as much in that spot. I would probably go for a check call like you did, then I'd go for a check shove on the turn, even if you missed. You hit on the turn, though. I still think you need to go ahead and raise. I would go ahead and make it 240 or something. And I would be raising here just to try to get him to pile the money in with, I don't know, a draw or something. You check the river and he bets 240. Now that he's taken this line, it's going to sound absurd, but I'm not too sure you should shove here. The thing is you have a 10, and since you have the 10, it's going to be really hard for him to have a boat. I don't know. The problem with shoving is what can he really call you with? I don't know. This is close. I'm not too sure what the right play is here between call or shove. You do the call, and I think that's probably fine. And he actually had you beat, so good call. If you had say Jack 9 instead of 10-9, I would have definitely shoved. No, wait, I definitely would have not. What am I trying to say? I definitely would not have shoved if you had Jack 9. But since you had a 10, it tilts it more towards a shove because you only lose now to King 9 and then one of the random 10s with a full house. I'd probably fold the Queen too. This is a good fold pocket threes here. You seemed a little bit prone to calling spots like this earlier, but I think this is a very easy fold. Obviously, this isn't exactly the same as having like 6-5. 6-5 is obviously much better than threes here, but I think it's like a no-brainer fold here with definitely the threes, probably the 6-5. Something else you can consider doing is you can consider 3-betting with the small pairs. It seems like you're just never 3-betting pre-flop unless you have a pretty strong hand. Well, here's exactly what I just said you probably shouldn't do. So now you are check calling with the threes. The only difference in this board and the last one is there was 2 high cards on the last board, now there's only 1. But notice that there are a lot of draws that your opponent could have. And again, if he doesn't have you beat now, he probably has plenty of equity to draw to have you beat. And you fold to the river bet. I would be prone to look up my opponent here on this river. I don't think he'd bet a 6. He could easily have a 7. He'd definitely bet an ace or a 7. Probably wouldn't bet a 9. So I think his range is kind of tilted towards bluffs here. So I would probably look him up, assuming I check called the flop. I would probably continuation bet here. This is a board where, even though you have something like middle pair, which is sort of a weak made hand, there are a lot of overcards that can come and destroy your hand, so I would go ahead and bet the flop. When he checks you on the turn, I probably would fire bet as you did. And on the river, I would definitely value bet with 2 pair. I'd probably bet like 120. You seem to bet weird numbers when you have a strong hand from time to time. I don't know if you're doing that on purpose or if it's like just a leak you don't know about, but be careful about that kind of thing. It's a pretty good check raise spot. You go for the out of position float though. This is called the Euro float here in America, amongst me and a few of my friends, where it seems like Europeans like to make this play where you do an out of position float. Let's see how you go about it. So you do the ridiculous creative version. Well, your hand sure looks strong. I mean, you made it look really strong. I don't know if you can get your opponent off an ace here, but yeah, your hand sure does look strong. I will give you that much. I basically never take that line with anything, but it is a line you need to take from time to time. King 10 here, you can shove. I probably would not call. The reason I wouldn't call is because, you're just going to be dominated here a lot of the time. Well, I can already see what's going to happen here. Your opponent's probably going to bluff off, and you're going to call down with a 10. Oh, well, no, he didn't. So anyways, I like the flop call, but if he continues firing, you probably need to fold. I'm not too sure you were looking to fold here. But if he continues firing, you need to fold. And especially against this player who hasn't really been too prone to bluff. I like the creative line with the Queen 10. I may have to try that tomorrow in the Epic Poker League event. I really try to not represent extreme strength too often, because it's really tough to have an extraordinarily strong hand. That being said, that was a fantastic board to represent, and that was like the best turn card in the world to represent it on, because your opponent probably doesn't have an ace, and if he does, he'll probably just fold it. And you could easily have a 7, or you could have an ace, or you could have a club draw that got there. So that was like the best spot ever. So I liked it. Ace 7, I'd probably just ship it in. He's getting to the point where you don't really want to be calling out of position. You're just better off shoving pre-flop. I'd value bet the river, so that's good. Well, right here you need to win 42% of the time. And it is probably close. Okay, I brought up Poker Stove here. I'm not too sure about your opponent's range. It's definitely iffy. I think your opponent may do this with some of the pairs. And I gave him these flush draws were only the diamond combination. So I gave him a few flush draws and then also some 4s and some 9s. Let's see how your hand does against that. So against that range you have 35%, so does that change anything? No. So you have 35%. So given that you need 42% to break even, you do have to fold, but that's kind of assuming your opponent never ever bluffs. And when he does bluff, he so it's basically assuming he never bluffs. If we add some bluffs into his range, which I think is probably not going to happen too much, we'll give him like overcard bluffs. See how that changes things. So it puts your equity right and your break even. So I don't know. It's close. I would probably fold though against this guy. Especially since this guy hasn't really shown that he's too prone to bluff. It's a pretty good spot to check raise. I usually like taking the aggressive line with my draws. You seem to be a little bit more prone to like run stone bluffs, whereas I tend to make more semi bluffs. I generally think you want to have equity when you're bluffing. I don't think too much good can come from just like blindly running bluffs. And when you get good spots, I think you're better off sort of like not getting quite as good of a spot, but having some equity. So you check raise the 10. I guess you plan on calling off. With the 6s, I think you'd be fine 3-betting and calling off or calling pre-flop. I like the check call here a lot. Unfortunately, your opponent doesn't have anything, but I would certainly bet the river. And on this river, I'd probably bet a little bit larger. Just hoping that he has a queen or some pair. I'd probably bet like 160. And he actually called with ace high, so that's kind of interesting. Didn't think he would call with ace high too often. I would probably ship it in with the ace 5. You seem to be a little bit more prone to take flops with ace X's than I am as well. Certainly worth noting. So a lot of trading chips back and forth. I would fold 9-4 all day, even against a guy that's relatively tight. All right, let's start this hand over since you decide to run a little river bluff. You bet the flop, check the turn. When you check the turn, I think a lot of opponents are going to discount a king or a 10 from your range. When you bet on the river, I don't think you're ever betting a 5 either, so you can't really have a king, a 10, or a 5. And because of that, a lot of opponents are going to look you up here, I would think. And of course he's going to call you with a 10, but I think I wouldn't be surprised if he called you a like 5-4. Your line looks pretty transparent there. I would definitely bet the turn like you do. On the river, this is a rough one. I'd probably go ahead and fire it. And I don't know if it would have worked or not, but you would have had a chance. I think your opponent should definitely bet the river here. See, he's not running bluffs that are like very standard spots to bluff. I mean, this is a spot where you just are never going to have a hand, so he should be bluffing this river every time. So there you rip it in with the sixes. I think this is the first time in a long time he's 3-bet you to a non-shove. I would be folding a lot of hands in this spot. Even though he does have a decent amount of chips, he seems relatively prone to just shoving it in. So you check call with the king 10. I think that's okay. On the turn, you're starting to get in this dangerous territory again. Luckily for you, he gives up. And like this is kind of a good example. A lot of the times, even when you do have these guys beat, they're gonna have a lot of equity. So you have to be careful in spots like this. I mean, I would have played it the exact same way, but it seems like you get yourself in those spots quite often. Luckily for you, every time you've been in this spot in this tournament, you've won. That's pretty cool. I'd probably check call here as well. I'd fold the turn though. Oh, high 10. On the river when you get there, I think all you can really do is, well, let's look at the pot. You know, I'm not going to say you should definitely shove here, but given that he only has a pot size bet left and the club draw missed, I don't know. That's really the only thing that missed. Everything else got there. I don't know. I guess checking's fine. The problem with this is that if you had 7-8, it got there. Also, all you're really doing is bluffing a club. And if you had a club draw, it could have easily backdoored into King Jack or Queen 10 or anything like that. So, yeah, I guess checking's probably best, and just hoping he spazzes with a 9 or an ace or something like that. But I would have just folded to the turn bet, as I said. I would definitely check shove here. You check raise to 220. I don't think it really matters. If I had an ace here, I would just check shove as well. I would never really make it 220 here with anything, but I think 220 is fine. And he gets there on you. He donks and you call with ace high. I think that's fine. You turn the nuts. That's beautiful. I would call again. I do not like raising here one bet. You definitely do want to get all the money in, of course, but I don't think raising's the way to do it. I would tank call here and try to get him to bet again on the river with whatever bluff he has. And if he has a king, you're going to stack him anyways. So he calls your min raise. River, you are definitely jamming, of course. And he had a king, so you would have gotten all the money anyways, I think. You got lucky, he donked the flop, though. Because I think if you just check back the flop, or if he checked and you bet, he probably would have just folded and you wouldn't have gotten this pot. So, luckily for you, he picked the exact wrong time to donk out. Alright, here's another match. Let's start over. I'm already not paying attention. Okay. You raise, he calls. You check back the flop for some reason. I think that's okay. I'd definitely fold to the river bet, though. Whenever you go from one heads-up match to another, obviously this should be clear and obvious, but make sure you don't transpose the last guy's game into this guy. And it's kind of difficult to do whenever you're playing heads-up matches back-to-back to back, especially if like one match lasts all the way into the next round. Notice this guy's making it 4 times your pre-flop raise. That's certainly interesting. I would bet the turn here for sure. And I would definitely call the river here. So you got owned. 3-4 suited, I would probably go ahead and see a flop. It's a pretty good hand. I mean, it's not a good hand, but it's certainly a good enough hand. So this guy seems to be 3-betting a lot already. I would probably go ahead and call here just like you did. I would tend to fire this flop if he checked me. When guys check, they usually check to give up, or they're checking because they have a monster. And they're a whole lot more likely to have nothing than they are to have a monster. So I would go ahead and just tend to throw out a bet there and see what happens. It doesn't have to be a big bet. Let's go back to this hand. You could bet, 140, and if he folds, he folds. Great. And if he doesn't, you can just give up. You haven't really risked much. I guess he got a call again. So this guy is hitting every hand on you. It's so frustrating whenever you get this deep in a heads-up tournament and a guy just hits every hand on you. One year I got down to... How many people were in it? I think there were 8 people left in the NBC heads-up tournament. It's a $20,000 buy-in heads-up tournament. And I played Chris Ferguson, and I just basically won every hand for the first pile of the match and got like a 7-1 chip lead. And then from there, he just got it all in, like 5 hands in a row and won every single time and busted me. And it was the most frustrating thing in the world, because if I win like one flip, you win the tournament, but instead you're going to lose. And sometimes that happens in the beginning of these things where you just lose every hand. Like, I guess, Chris Ferguson lost every hand at the beginning. And it's pretty annoying whenever there's nothing you can really do, but that is sort of the nature of heads-up games, and you can't really let that frustrate you. I would definitely bet bigger on the river here. I'd bet like 150. Your opponent could easily have a queen or a 10 and probably won't fold. When you do just lose every hand, just keep your wits about you. Don't do anything crazy. Don't start raising 5-2 offsuit and piling the money in anytime you get anything. I would just check it down here with the king. I would not fold to a river bet if he bet the river. On this river, he should consider a value bet. I'd probably call here with the queen 9 suited. I wouldn't say I'd do it every time, but queen 9 suited is a pretty good hand. He bets the flop and you rip it in on him. I think it's a little dicey. I'm not going to say it's bad by any means, but it's certainly dicey. I think it's fine though. And he has the 4-2 and decides to call it off. Well, clearly this guy's not very good. And you hold up, so that is wonderful. Basically, against this guy, seeing the way he's playing, I would just make a hand and not fold it. I like this river bet here a lot. I think you'll pick it up a decent amount of the time. It's a very good river bet. Anytime a scare card comes on the river and your opponent's shown a lot of weakness, it's never really bad just to throw out a bet there. Yeah, I'd go ahead and go all in right here as well. I don't really like calling here because there are a lot of bad turns that will make it pretty difficult to play. And he's just going to continue with his aggression, so I don't really like this. I guess you're calling down here to try to get him to bluff off. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, that's good. You would think that's good. But he gets there on you. I think that's a... I would have jammed the flop, honestly. When he check raises the flop here. Whenever he has this few chips behind, even though he could be stone bluffing, you're probably better off just getting it in and trying to get him off whatever equity he has. Like, it's not a disaster for him to fold a flush draw here. You're happy with that. I would bet the turn every time. But, the problem with the check call is that now you're just going to have to check the river, unless you want to donk, which looks pretty strong. And the problem with checking the river is that he's just going to check it back a lot of the time. I mean, that's exactly what happens, and I'm not a bit surprised. So, I don't really like that hand. Here your opponent donks the turn. I would probably go ahead and put in a small raise. Now, when he shows extreme strength by donking, I would go ahead and raise it up. I'd make it like 260. And obviously you're not folding. But when he does the donk bet there, I would just go ahead and raise it up. Of course, you jam the river and he folds. I'd probably check call here. If there was like a flush draw or something, or if it was like queen jack 5, I'd probably check shove to try to make it my hand look like a draw. But when it's queen 5-3, you know, he can't really have anything. So I like the check call here. And of course, you have to value bet the river. I think that's perfectly fine. I would bet the river every time. Anytime there's a 4 straight on board, it's never really bad to bet the river, especially if your opponent's checked it all the way down and you have no showdown value. Just throw it a little bet. Bet 60 chips and you'll pick it up a lot of the time, because your opponent probably doesn't have a pair, and if he doesn't have a pair on a board like this, he just has to fold. It's just so easy for you to backdoor into something on a board like that. Well, that's a good flop. I like the bet. I think you definitely need to bet when you make the flush on that board. I think a bet here is fine, a small bet. I think there's no problem with that. When he jams, of course, you're going to call. The problem with a small bet here is that I guess a small bet has to be better than a big bet here, because he probably doesn't have much, and if he doesn't have anything, he can't call much of a bet. So yeah, I guess a small bet is in order. So I like the way you play this one too. Seems like you're playing a lot of hands very well in this video. Alright, we'll go ahead and go over another match or two, however many are left. It seems like they're going to be short ones. Very first hand, this guy's name sounds familiar. I don't know if he's a regular or not, but it sounds familiar. I would bet the turn here for sure. I think there are a lot of spots that your opponent can't really have much of anything where you should really be betting, and you're not. So I think usually they're in small pots too, so don't be scared to throw a little bet here on the turn. Your opponent bets the river though and you call. I think this is just suicide. You're going to be ahead here so rarely, and your opponent could even be bluffing with, like, you know, 5-3 or something like that. So I think that's not a good bluff, or not a good call. And interestingly enough, if you bet the turn, he may have folded. Probably not, but maybe. But when he bets the river, you have to fold there every time. So as soon as I tell you you're doing good and playing a lot of your hands good, you butcher 2 of them in a row. Or 1 of them in a row. Can't do 1 in a row. What am I saying? It's getting late here, guys. Sorry about that. This is a pretty good flop to check raise if he bets. On the turn, I would probably just give up. If you guys can hear the idiots yelling below me, I'm sorry. Again, I'm at the Palms here, and the Palms is known as a place for young people to hang out, and most young people act like idiots. I'd probably check it back here with the queen. So that's a good check back. Remember in the first video I talked about how you weren't really checking it back too often with weakish hands, or with weak made hands, but you seem to have been doing it in these other games, so that's very good. You just need to make sure you're not checking back every time you intend to just check fold. I'd like a check raise here, but I think this is interesting. Certainly not folding now. On the river, if he bet, I'd probably look him up. This guy seems to be pretty aggressive. I'd probably go ahead and fire another barrel here with a double gut shot. And it comes in, so I'd go ahead and fire again. I'd bet probably like 260. And he got 2 pairs, so that's fantastic. You're just going to demolish this guy, it looks like. I'd probably bet the turn for value here. You will get called by ace high quite often. I would definitely call the river. Wow, I'm shocked you folded the river here. I mean, he did overpot it. I guess maybe he picked up a 7 and decided to overpot it. Perhaps that's what scared you out of here, but I'd probably just go ahead and look him up. When he checks it all the way down, he probably just has nothing. I would have value bet the turn for sure, though, to try to get called by ace high. I think you can bet again here. This is a spot where you could easily have a pretty good piece of this board. On the river, he overpots it again. I would just certainly jam. I would never not shove here. I guess these overpots are kind of scaring you, but seeing him make the overpot the last hand really discounts the value of this overpot. I would just jam here every time. I mean, you may think there's not a whole lot he can call you with, but he can certainly call you with any 10. He'll probably call you with a queen. He's definitely going to call you with king jack or jack 8. So yeah, I would shove here every time. And as you see, he did run the bluff, so this guy does have some moves in his game. I'd go ahead and fire it again with the king for value. He donks the river. I mean, I guess I'd call. Not really think anything else he can do. So maybe this guy's not a regular. I don't really like his game. He's just going nuts. I would just go for 3 streets of value here as well to try to stack him. And I would jam the river. Good shove. But he folds, unfortunately. You finally got the aces. That's pretty cool. We're about 400 hands into this tournament, and you got the aces once. You really haven't had too many very strong premium hands. You had ace-king like 20 times, but besides that, I don't think there were too many kings. I think queens once. So it's good to get so deep and not get too many good hands. So let's go back a hand. I got to talking. I would probably just jam the ace-5 pre-flop. You don't really want stuff like this to happen. Yeah, I would jam king 3. With king 5, I think I would just find a call. It's close, but I think this guy's going to start shoving very wide. And you do call, and you chop it up. I would shove the ace 3. Shove with the ace 4. And you get there. So now we are here at the final game. We'll go over this one real quick, and we will call it a video. At this point, you're probably playing for a lot of money. I don't know if they allow for chops in this event, but I would suggest you not chop unless you're bad at heads up. And you definitely seem like you're good enough at heads up to not want to chop here. So, yeah, I would definitely play against most people. A lot of guys, they'll play either too timid or just plain bad when they start playing for this much money. So you definitely want to let them play bad. I'd call the 3-bet here. One thing I have noticed is that you're not I don't think you 4-bet this entire tournament. And maybe that's because they're not 3-betting you too often. But definitely look at that in your game. Maybe 3-betting's not necessary against guys that aren't... I'm sorry, maybe 4-betting's not necessary against guys that aren't 3-betting too often, but I know I 4-bet sometimes. I mean, I used to play... Actually, I still do on Cake Network. I play some $500 heads-up sit and goes occasionally, and I find myself and my opponents 4-betting all in fairly often, I guess because we're 3-betting a decent amount. Something to think about, though. I like the check raise here. It's pretty strong. And I would definitely bet the turn. And I would check this river. The board kind of ran off ugly. And your opponent called you down pretty light. I don't know if he would have called you on the river, but maybe he would have. So here you 3-bet, and your opponent 4-bets like clockwork. First thing I talk about is 4-betting, and now your opponent 4-bets. I would jam here. I think ace queen is definitely good enough to get it all in. If I had ace jack here, I wouldn't be near as happy about it, but I'd probably shove as well. If I had pocket 9s, I'd go with it. Pocket 8s, I'd go with it. So yeah, I guess that's about my range. Ace jack and then 8s are better. And I would have been in trouble with the 8s. But that's no problem for you, and you win. I think you won 2 big coin flips in this tournament that mattered. I think you had ace king against jacks earlier, and now you win with ace queen against 10s. And if all it takes you to win this event is to win 2 coin flips, then it's a pretty easy game. So all in all, I think you play some pretty good heads-up poker. They're just those few little points I talked about throughout the videos. And I'd love to hear your comments and anyone else's comments. And if you guys like my review of the members' hand histories, please let me know. And if you think they're no good, let me know that too, because I want to do everything I can to make these videos as educational as possible for you guys. So yeah, leave me your comments. This has been Jonathan Little for PokerStrategy.com. Thanks for watching.